If you've ever been to a fancy restaurant, you might have noticed a little edible garnish put on top of your steak or another dish that you've got in your entree. And what that garnish might have been was microgreens. We're going to show you an easy way to grow microgreens in your home, and you can do it all year round. And in fact, it doesn't take a lot of effort, and like I said, it's pretty simple to do in your home. There's a couple of things to keep in mind, and that's the light, as well as the ventilation, and also which type of garnish you want to grow, or which type of microgreen you want to grow. So the first thing that you're going to need is some sort of container. You can buy a cute little container like what we have here. We just picked these up at a nearby hobby store. This one actually comes with a plastic liner in it. Of course, we're going to need to drill holes in this, or you can do something like this that's just a big dish. Again, this already has holes in it. So we're going to go ahead and drill holes so that we have plenty of drainage in our decorative container here. All right, now that we've got our holes put in here, another thing you can do, because this one already came with a liner, we didn't have to worry about that, but if you were worried about protecting your container, you can just use something like a old plastic sack and actually line it that way. Again, you want to make sure that you have some holes to allow for drainage. Also, when you're selecting a container, it really doesn't need to even be this deep. One that's only about an inch or two will actually work for microgreens, because we're not going to be growing the plant for very long, and so they're not going to have very many roots to produce. Once we have our container ready to go, what we're going to then do is fill it with some pre-moistened potting soil, or I should say potting media, because this does not have any actual soil in it. Just to reduce your amount of pathogens that can spread to your greens, you want to use something that doesn't contain any compost or soil. So this is just a mix of potting media. Sometimes that media can be hard to get wet initially, because it might have some sphagnum moss in it and things like that. And so by moistening it ahead of time, you know that you've got it good and wet throughout. Again, you can see it's not, you can't squeeze any water out of it. It's not saturated to that point, but it is moist. Once we have our soil filled in here, or our potting media, because there is no soil in here, filled in our box, then it's time to figure out which seeds we want to plant in here. Now, if we're looking at cool season crops, they can handle a little bit lower temperature for germination than warm season crops, but all of them do really well in the range from 65 to 75 degrees, which is often the average home ambient temperature. So that's why I said this works really well. You just need to make sure that you have a good sunny window. Another thing to consider when you're picking your seeds that you want to select is as far as the germination time. Well, here you can see we've got a couple of different plants mixed in together. We've got some radish, and then some sweet peas, and then another type of radish here. And so some plants will germinate within 10 to 15 days, which is relatively quickly, and that's when you could harvest them. And some need about another week longer, 16 to 25 days. And so radishes tend to germinate a little bit faster than, say, carrots. And so that's one of the reasons why when you're harvesting, you want to make sure that you're able to harvest the whole crop at once. If you're concerned about mixing, then you might just pick one container and stick with one seed in that. Herbs are another plant that you can use, but they're going to again take a little bit longer until you germinate. We actually have a few herbs that we're going to plant together here. We have some cilantro and some dill, and then a globette basil. So we're going to plant this with a few different herbs. So as we harvest that, that'll mix those microgreens together to add to our garnish. Another thing to think about when you pick your seeds is the actual flavor that you're trying to achieve. So of course, because they're microgreens, their flavor is going to be really rich, a little bit more intense, and it's also very densely packed with nutrients. So we're just going to sprinkle these seeds across the top here. You don't want to do them too densely, because again, that will reduce the airflow. So we're going to divide this up into thirds here, basically. So we've got our cilantro on this end, and then we're going to plant some dill. Normally, dill is a plant that you would not plant in something this small and narrow because it'll get a couple of feet tall. Because we are just after the microgreens, as soon as it germinates in about 15 days, we'll be harvesting this shortly after that. So again, this works out really well to put dill in there for a microgreen. And then finally, we're going to put some globe basil in our last section here. Then of course we want to make sure that we label our plants that we put in there, just so we know again what seeds are coming up. And also to keep track of how long it takes to germinate. That's important. And also as you're kind of sampling them, you can see when you have the optimal flavor that you're desiring and know as you go through the future when you should really harvest those microgreens. So the last thing that you want to do is just to make sure that you get seed contact with the soil, and you're just going to press your hands on that soil and the seed to ensure that there's good contact there. So we pretty much have it all done. We're going to go ahead and water them lightly, just again to make sure there's good contact. You want to use something that's not going to really wash your seed. So again, probably don't use a hose, just a mist or something like that. A little sprinkler will work fine. And then at this point, we are concerned about the humidity. We want to make sure that there is a lot of moisture around these seeds as they're trying to germinate. So there's a couple of ways that you can do that. You can use plastic by putting a plastic tent over these, and that will help create that greenhouse effect. If it's something smaller, like what we used here, that we call this kind of our salad bowl, and in fact this is a recycled take-home container that we actually germinated using the lid. Now, of course, as these start to germinate and you see that sprout come up, you're going to need to remove the lid. And also keep in mind that any sort of warm day that you have, that can really accelerate the heating process in here. And in fact, it can heat up so quickly that that will actually kill any seedlings that are starting to sprout. So you have to be cautious with that. Something like this, where we've got some microgreens lettuce growing in here, we could have started those by putting that whole container into a Ziploc baggie or something like that. So again, using a baggie on something like this will just allow that humidity to stay high and promote that germination. And again, we used a decorative container, but there's no reason that you couldn't use something like a flat with cell packs in it. And in fact, these are really great, again, because they allow for the amount of depth that you need. And we've got this just on a cooking sheet here. And the nice thing about this sheet is you can water from the bottom and allow that water to be soaked up through the plant. And the nice thing about that is, again, you're reducing the amount of splash that might occur on that foliage, reducing any chance of pathogens getting onto the foliage that you're going to be eating. Now again, you can almost use any sort of vegetable or herb as microgreens, anything that's edible. So here we've got some onions, which will give you more of an onion flavor. Again, the radishes are going to give you more of a hot, spicy flavor to it. And another factor to think about when you're planting your seeds is the color and the texture that you might want to add to your dish. And so you can see that there's some different red colored lettuce and also some red stem radishes that you can get. And again, that's just going to add some variety and some interest to your meal when you're using these microgreens. So at this point, we're ready to harvest. We have a lettuce mix here that is definitely a microgreen. You can see how small they are. Typically, you're going to harvest your microgreens when they're only 1 inch to 2 inches. So we're just going to come in here with a pair of snips, and you want to cut right above the soil line. Again, trying not to interfere with that soil to reduce any chance of dirt getting onto your plants. So here we have some radishes, and if you look at these, we have 2 different types of leaves. So here we have the seed leaves, or the cotyledons, and then we also have the true leaves, which are the leaves that actually look like a radish leaf. So these are a little bit almost past being a microgreen, but they're definitely still edible. They just might be a little off on their flavor. So again, that's why it's important to take notes as you go through so you know exactly when to harvest. And believe me, a day or 2 can make a difference in how quickly your microgreens grow. So we're just going to come in here and harvest again right above the soil line, taking the cotyledons and everything. Now, because we are harvesting these plants at such a young age, you really are only getting 1 crop off of the seeds that you grow. So for that reason, After we harvest this container, we'll want to go ahead and change the soil out and plant a new seed crop in here with either the same seeds or different seeds depending on what we want. But the nice thing about microgreens is that you can continue to plant another crop and have succession planting. That way each week you can harvest. Now you can see we've got our microgreens. We're going to take these back and just wash them thoroughly. You want to be gentle as you're handling these because they are somewhat fragile. They won't last quite as long as what our fresh cut lettuce, mature lettuce would last. These are only going to last probably about 5 to 10 days in the refrigerator. So that's where your succession planting will help to ensure that you have another crop to use for your next meal. So if you're looking for a great way to dress up your next dinner party, try growing your own microgreens.
We hope you enjoyed this video. It's part of our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. You can also find even more videos on our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel. And join us on social media for great gardening tips, photos, and discussion.